Hi, everyone. My name is Elaine Rayborn from Sandia National Laboratories, and I am the panel lead and normally the moderator for this Strategies for Working Remotely panel. But today, we're actually going to focus on some invited talks from the SC22 Early Career Program. And for those of you who aren't familiar with SC22, that's our supercomputing conference. It's our annual meeting. And I was very fortunate to be invited to give a talk with my colleagues Scott and Julie, who are going to be joining us to talk about their lessons learned from over their careers that you can apply today for your own career advancement. And so our panel moderator today is Suzanne Paretecun. And as I said, I'm joined by Scott Callahan from University of Southern California and Julia Mullen from MIT Lincoln Laboratory. And so just to give you a little background about this particular panel series, we have been doing this since really the pandemic began. And this is our 15th panel. And we have started to move into doing our panels quarterly. And so in this particular discussion, what we're going to do is we're actually going to share some slides today, which normally we don't do that. We're going to share some slides. We'll talk about our lessons learned. We'll basically give our talks that we gave at SC. And we want to break them up by having some audience Q&A. So we really encourage you to really ask us some hard questions. You know, I personally hope that we get some really hard questions. Make us, you know, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. If you would like to say anything, raise your hand, and then we're happy to call on you. So, Scott, would you like to kick us off? I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so you can share yours.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me
Great, thank you.
Here. Great. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Elaine. I appreciate the opportunity to talk. My name is Scott Callahan. I'm a computer scientist at the Southern California Earthquake Center. My employer is based in Los Angeles, but I actually live and work from Reno, Nevada. So the title of my talk today is The Elephant in the Room, Balancing Parental and Work Responsibilities. Any of you who have tried to have a Zoom call with young kids in the background know exactly where the title of my talk comes from. So I want to start by just kind of acknowledging and sharing the perspective that I bring to this content. And so these are my kiddos. They are 7 and 4. I like them. I've spent a lot of time with them. I've been working full-time remotely since 2008, before it was cool. And they were home for about a year and a half in the throes of the pandemic. So if you have questions about teenagers, I'm probably not your person. You should ask Julie. She's got older kids. But so this, my perspective is more kind of from having younger kids. I also, I am a straight cis white guy, and I live in the US and work for a US based employer. And I know that also affects my perspective on kind of family and employee balance as well. So what if you're a parent? What are some ideas for how to kind of thread the needle here and try to find the balance between parental and work responsibilities? So my first suggestion for you, especially if you're a new parent, is to postpone that need to balance as long as possible by taking your parental leave. So in the US, only about half of women and a third of men take all the leave to which they are entitled. This discrepancy is actually one of the reasons why women tend to experience more discrimination around having kids than men do, because the perception is that women will take their leave and men won't. So men, please take all the parental leave to which you are entitled. Once you're back at work, I strongly suggest creating a schedule, right? Figuring out, okay, what time am I at work? When am I on kids? When am I free? Both kind of practically to figure out, okay, when am I available to have meetings and such, but also to help you kind of mentally plan your day. And the schedule doesn't necessarily have to look the same as your pre-parental schedule looked, right? It may be that you like to maybe spend a little time earlier in the mornings before the kids get up when it's quiet. maybe that's a good time for you to get work done. Maybe your kids are done with outside the home care in the middle of the afternoon, and so you want to take a little bit of that time off and then come back at it later in the evening. My 7-year-old finishes school at about 3:20 every day, and so sometimes I take a pause then, and I spend time with her, and then after she goes to bed, then I go back and I get some more work done. Another recommendation I have is manageable to-do lists. The keyword here, of course, is manageable, right? If you have a to-do list that has items like write this paper or write this complex piece of software, you're never going to get those checked off, and they're just going to feel overwhelming and judgmental, right? You want items where you can make progress on them every day. So if you have big tasks, right, you want to break them down into small subtasks. So every day you can cross them off and see that you've actually gotten something done. I also suggest putting tasks on your list that are kind of varying in terms of the amount of focus they require from you. For instance, we all have some tasks that are super creative, right? That you have to do writing, you are designing something, you are problem solving. But we also all have tasks that are kind of part of our work that require kind of less intense focus, right? Maybe responding to emails or writing a test suite or moving files around. And so it's good to have both of these as to-do items, because sometimes, right, you're going to be in a position where you can do that focus, but other times you might be splitting your attention between work and watching kids. You might be doing something in the evening when you're a little tired, but you still want to check items off your list. And it's good to have a range of tasks to pick from. One thing I didn't necessarily expect before I had kids is that if you let them, kids are actually really good for helping you find kind of work-life balance. Because, right, sometimes they come up and they ask you to read a book with them or play a game or go play outside or all kinds of activities that you absolutely cannot do while you are working, right? And so I found that it can be really nice to take advantage of those, to put the laptop away, go do that, spend time with your family. And then when you come back, you've had a break, you're kind of ready to engage with your work tasks in a different way. What if you're a parent who has kids at home all the time? Maybe this is short term, maybe somebody's sick, maybe this is medium term, you have a school break, maybe it's long term, maybe we get a new pandemic and everybody's home for a really long time again. I mentioned it before, but I'm going to highlight it again. No, really, you need to create a schedule. So as I mentioned, my kids were home for about 1.5 years during the pandemic. This included distance kindergarten. Do not get me started on distance kindergarten. But both my wife and I were in full-time jobs. My wife is a university professor, and kind of the only way that we were able to work through this and make it so that we could fulfill all of our work and family obligations was to have a strict schedule. For us, it was every 2 hours we flipped. So you were on work for 2 hours and on kids for 2 hours, and went back and forth all day long, except for nap when everybody got to work. And that was extremely helpful for figuring out when I was available to meet with people, and also just for kind of figuring out what chunks I should take my work and fit it into. Another suggestion I have is to have a defined office space. Ideally, this is, a room, but sometimes that's not possible. And so even if it's just a certain chair or a desk or a corner, having a physical location, which is your work location, can be really helpful. It reminds everyone else that when you're in that location, you're on work time, you're focused on that, and reminds people to try to not bother you. It also reminds you, right? It's kind of replicating that, in-office experience, right? If you commute and go to a physical different location, it sends you all those contextual cues that now you're at work. And so it's trying to replicate that in a home environment. The other thing, of course, you have to remember is it goes both ways, right? When you are in the workspace, then you are focused on work. But then when you leave the workspace, you also need to be not focused on work, right? And then that's the cue that you're available and that you're no longer kind of on work time. I also suggest, setting expectations and boundaries both with your family and with your employers, right? To say, okay, these are the times that I'm available. These are the times that I'm not. This is when I can handle these kind of requests. This is when I can't. On the family side, one of the challenges when you're working with kids from home is that sometimes you have situations where you really need to not be interrupted, right? You have a meeting where you're leading a discussion, or you have a presentation you're giving. And so I found it helpful to have kind of special toys or activities or games or movies during that time. It did have the unintended side effect that my kids started really looking forward to my meetings, which was a little weird. They'd be like, "Yay, Daddy's got meetings." And I wasn't quite sure what to do with that. But it was helpful for them also to then have that extra kind of reminder that, oh, the reason we're having something special is because now you're at work and it's not a good time to interrupt you unless it's something urgent. What if you don't have kids, but you have colleagues who have kids and you'd like to be supportive to them? So I thought about this for a while, and I think honestly, most of the recommendations here boil down to just being a good coworker. All right, my first suggestion is, to be supportive, even if you don't necessarily understand or relate to why something is a challenge for your colleague. So for example, right, let's say you email your colleague and say, hey, can we meet tomorrow at 9? And your colleague says, no, 9's really not good for me. And you might think, I don't understand. What's wrong with 9, right? I thought the kids got dropped off at school at 8. That seems like a perfectly reasonable time to me, right? My suggestion is to let it go, is even though you don't understand it, trust your colleague that that's not a time that works for them, and reply, all right, what about 9:30? Is that better for you? We typically think about kind of flexibility and support in terms of working hours when we talk about this, right? Like the example I just mentioned. Or maybe, for instance, if you email your colleague at 4, you're unlikely to get a response until maybe they're back on at 8 or 9. But there are other ways that you can be supportive in this as well. Another example, for instance, is having your camera on during Zoom meetings, right? If your coworker has kids at home, they may not want to have their camera on most of the time because they may have a lot going on. And so try to see if you can respect that. The other thing that I thought of, which again, I think is just general good coworker behavior, is to look for opportunities to praise your colleagues' work, especially to managers and supervisors. Oftentimes, your colleagues who, especially if they have new kids, may be fighting some stereotypes about the level of commitment to work. And so looking for opportunities to point out work that they've done, oh, they did a great job on this project. I asked for help on this, and I really appreciate them being able to take this on. Helps to remind your supervisors that your coworkers are both parents and also positively contributing members to the organization. I want to conclude talking a little bit more about the emotional side of all this, because I think honestly, in many ways, that is the most difficult. I'm going to say that all employed parents feel the same conflict that you do about balancing parental and work obligations. And many of us have a lot of complex feelings about work. So you might feel relief, right? You might think, oh, thank goodness, I finally get a break from the kids. I get to go do some work. You might feel guilt. You might think, well, a good parent wouldn't be working. A good parent certainly wouldn't want to be working. You might feel a lack of motivation, right? It may be that work doesn't feel as important to you anymore because your priorities have shifted a little bit. You might feel resentment. You might resent work. You might feel like, oh, why am I doing this? It's taking time away from my kids. Or it might be the opposite. You might feel like, oh, I really wanted to get this paper done tonight. Why won't my kids just go to bed, right? All of these feelings are very normal. Having multiple of these feelings at the same time is very normal. This is an area where I think mentorship can really have a positive impact. That if you have a mentor who has also had kids, they can help you kind of talk through these feelings, help you understand that these are normal, and see, are there any changes that maybe you want to make to help you feel better about finding this balance. Self-care, right? It's important. I know that it's important. I also know that it's really difficult to find time for this. Do what you can. Being able to do some self-care helps make you both a better parent and a better employee. Don't be afraid to ask for what you need. So if there are changes to your situation, whether it's asking your partner for changing some way that family obligations or habits are set up, or it's about asking your employer for a change to your work environment or your projects or whatever, everybody around you wants you to succeed, right? And so if you identify changes that would help with that, go for it, ask for those. And finally, I just want to remind all of you out there who are parents that by being a working parent, you are modeling to your kids that you are a complex human being, right? That you achieve satisfaction through a number of different aspects of your life. And your kids will see that, and they will notice that, and they will value you for that. So that's the end of my slides. So I am open to any questions you may have now, and also at the end we'll have a broader panel discussion for all of us too. So if you think of questions later, feel free to ask them then. I'll go ahead and
Thank you,
stop sharing
Scott.
so I can see everybody's face.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. That was great. We appreciate it. The first time you gave the presentation at the at SC at the Early Career Program, we really had a lively discussion based on this idea, of parenting and being early career. And I think I remember what was also mentioned was it's really about caring for others, right? I mean, we had one individual in the program who was also caring for, I believe, aging parents. And so caretaking in general, I would imagine that all of your lessons learned really apply to that as well.
Yeah, I agree. This talk obviously I had it geared towards parents with young kids, just because that's my personal perspective. But yeah, I think a lot of us are facing challenges with caretaking, for whether it's for family
Yeah.
members of different ages and at different life stages, and just more generally in balancing those responsibilities with your work responsibilities is tricky, right? And it's something that we're all trying to find our equilibrium on.
Yeah, it is very tricky. So there is a question that I'd like to ask you, and that is, what do you think are there pandemic related changes to our work environment that are disappearing? And maybe which pandemic related changes haven't disappeared?
So I know that a number of people are starting to go back to work in person, right, in a physical location, at least part of the time. That's I think we're drifting away, generally speaking, from full-time remote work. Um, but I think people are still working from home a lot more than they used to. Um,
Right.
I also think, or like to think, that there's a little bit of a switch in how um, that people are more eager to pull the plug on, I'm feeling sick, and so I'm not going to spend time around other people today. And maybe that's a bit of optimism on my own part, but I think it's normalized a little more. You know, being sick is a sufficiently good reason for not hanging around others or for keeping your kids home from school. And so I think as a result of that too, there's more people being open about that, about their kids being sick, so I'm staying home. Um, and generally speaking, a little more sharing about those personal responsibilities, about the other obligations that people have on their time. Because I think once we kind of open that box, right, once people working from home with their kids full time and had to share, oh, I can't meet right now, I have to go deal with my kid, or just other family obligations. Once you kind of open that box and talked about that with your coworkers, I think we all feel a little more comfortable continuing to have those more open dialogues about the other parameters and restrictions and just different loads that we all balance.
Yeah, and from a personal perspective, I think it actually really assisted with having some more intimate conversations about our family lives because, actually they were opened up. As you said, you refer to it as Pandora's box. And so it kind of opened up the ability for someone to peek inside your life and to see that sometimes it's a little messier than it can be, or sometimes it's not. And so that was, I think, a really nice artifact of the pandemic, actually.
It also helped us in that aspect maybe feel a little less alone. I discovered, because people were more open about this, that many of my colleagues have their own challenges that I wasn't always aware of before. And it kind of helps remind me that we all have our own challenges and struggles, and we're all finding ways through, and we can be empathetic to each other when we have those moments.
Right.
I was
So,
going to say also, so my children are significantly older. And so my daughter's 35 and my son is 30. And when they were young, when they were Scott's children's ages, my husband routinely took Tuesday, shifted his schedule so he could take them to Suzuki class. And I routinely because you had to be in person at some place, it was much harder to say, I'm going to do this 2 hours. The 2 hours and 2 hours that Scott had didn't work. I mean, granted, you also had some daycare that you could, where children would be, but it was very hard to say, my child is sick, I have to stay home. It was just not acceptable. I find that in the time frame since they were young to now, it is much more acceptable, especially for men. It was sort of like when a woman would say it, when the mother would say it, people would be like, oh, well, and women would definitely feel someone's going to think that I'm not a responsible worker. But when men would say, it just wasn't said by men. And so I think this is one of the big changes that's happened. It's happened slowly, and then I think the pandemic really opened that up. So I'm hopeful that we don't go backwards. To Scott's point about everybody being a little more open, I'm hoping that we've sort of normalized that this is we can all work even though and balance these challenges.
right, exactly. So there's a question in the chat, which is from Alfred. So thank you, Alfred, for your question. If you'd like, you can unmute and ask it yourself, or I can ask it for you. Don't know how you feel about that. Yeah, thanks.
Yes. So just wondering, sometimes getting along with the family can be a difficult thing, right? When you have a lot of people in a small space, relatively small space, that can create more conflict. One example is having meeting with your family over Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever, right? When you put a lot of people together in one place, that can create conflict. So when the person normally will work in the office, then the person is away doing his own thing, that create less opportunities for conflict. But when you have to put many more people in the same environment, that sometimes can be a problem. For example, you have to maybe you have to shut the door on your kids or your wife or whatever when they have needs, and then you say, well, sorry, I cannot talk to you. That can create some tension. Or when you have a meeting, you have to go and tell the kids to shut up or something like that. There's another opportunity to create conflict. So you have more things to work on. You have more opportunity to resolve conflicts when you put more people together and spending more time together. So I just wonder if that's a problem.
Yeah, it can definitely be a challenge when everybody, like you said, everybody's home for a long time. Right during lockdown, one of our challenges, was that, and so pretty early on we set the ground rules of the person who's up in the office is really off kid responsibilities, and the kids got that pretty quickly. But it's still a challenge because sometimes there's a fight going on, right? Like you can hear, right? It's just the other side of a door, and so that your co-parent is having a bad go at it, and that was always really challenging for both me and my wife to kind of know that your partner is struggling. And you have to let them do it because you don't want your kids to feel like you're undermining their authority, and that they're going to get it. But it's still hard, right? To know that like it's a tough day, but you just need to keep your head down and do your work. But I think this is generally a good point that you bring, that it can be a challenge that if you're working full time from home, of making sure that you don't have both responsibilities ooze into each other all the time, right? I think if you end up in a position where you're kind of half working and half available for home stuff all day, then I think that also can lead to frustration because you feel like you're always being pulled in two directions. You're always trying to get some work done, but you're also always trying to be present. And I found, at least for myself, that I feel kind of more successful, more satisfied when I'm able to compartmentalize a little more and say, okay, this time I'm working and I'm not available, but then I need to put that down, right? And leave the laptop in there. And this time I am available and engaged and not doing work. And I found that helps me, the compartmentalization, to try to keep, prevent the two from just merging together all the time.
Yeah, I also want to say, Alfred, thanks a lot for the way that you framed your question, because I think that you turned it into an opportunity to actually improve, and to become better at resolving conflict. And I think that's a really excellent attitude to have going into a situation like that. So yeah, I think that that can be really challenging, but what do you think, Scott? I think that you get better at it over time if you practice and if the family's communicating and people are aware of the boundaries, right?
Yeah, exactly. And like anything, right, it's establishing habits. And so, once you've kind of established, okay, this is how, this is what having a parent working from home is going to look like for a family. And once people get used to that, then, it's like any habit. You're, okay, that's how it works. That's fine. And yeah, there's still going to be bad days occasionally. But I think establishing this is what this looks like for a family and then sticking to that helps everybody, parents and kids, to find something that works. And it doesn't mean you can't change it, right? You try it. No, okay, this isn't working real well. We need to change that around. But I think then everybody knows what the situation is and, can respond to it appropriately.
Okay. I have a question for you that I'm going to reserve until later when we have our big group discussion. And let's see, Monty, you asked a question of Scott. Would you like to unmute and ask it yourself? Or would you prefer that I do it?
I was going to add one thing to what Scott said. Well, actually highlight something that he said in his slides, which is I think if you have this place where your children know, oh, she is working now, then it's a little bit easier. I mean, even mine when because I was in graduate school. I was doing my PhD when I had children, and so you know how that's like all the time. So but I had a desk, and when I was at the desk, so there was a computer. When I was at that computer, I was working. You know, so even on the weekend, because I would work when they napped, and when they got up, they would find me, and then I would finish and make that shift that Scott's talking about. But having a place that they can say, oh, they're working now, makes it a little easier for them to make that separation.
Mhm. Yeah,
I don't know,
So-
Scott, at least that's what I would think. I don't know.
Yeah, the same issue for us. For us, we were able to have it to be a physically separate room, and having that door, you know, it doesn't keep the sound out, but it is useful for a physical reminder, right? It takes some extra effort to go and open the door, and so in that moment, it kind of gives you a chance to be like, wait a minute, that's not what I'm supposed to be doing. We were also able to communicate the concept of the meeting, even to my youngest, who was about 2 at the time, that there was a difference between someone is having a meeting and someone is not having a meeting. The difference being the permitted noise level. Right, that you were allowed, we tolerated a much higher level of indoor noise if a meeting was not happening. And the nature of both of our jobs was that meetings were, you know, maybe 25% of the time. So, you know, most of the time it's fine, but then occasionally it's meeting time. So for the next hour, we're going to engage in quieter activities.
Yeah, that's good. I think too, if you take meetings, for example, on an iPad, that might also signal, you know, to the younger members of the family, this is a device that I use for fun. And so having that dedicated computer or posture or location in the house where, you know, you're delineating this is for work. I think that's a really good strategy that you have both proposed. So we've got one more question, a couple of questions here. We can keep on going. Let's see. So we've got one from Monty, which is, we've spent multiple lifetimes setting up the working in the office model. What other efforts or issues do you think are essential to focus on for a more dispersed, hybrid, or fully remote team? Is it reasonable to think that the company should patiently invest in a new model as enthusiastically and as determined as the work in the office model? So that is a really good question there. Two-part question there. Who'd
Feeds
like
into my it will feed into my talk.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we'll table that. Monty, we're going to table your question then. Are you okay with that, Scott?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
All
fine.
right.
That's great.
Okay, so Monty, you want to add a little bit more context to your question that we will answer after Julia's talk?
Yeah. Now or after the talk?
Why don't you wait until after the talk? I'd
Okay.
like you to come back.
Sure.
All right, thank you. That's good. And then Jessica asked if we have any recommendations for children that are too young to understand that you're working.
Yeah. So this was always a challenge. This is one of the ones where I found that there was some kinds of disconnect between people who had kids and people who didn't. Because when I had mine, like at like 6 months, I remember people who did not have kids being like, "Oh, that must be great. You can just sit at home and work on the sofa and keep an eye on them." And and of course, thank you very much. Right. These recommendations only came from people who had never had kids, because this is not how it works. Right. It's not how it works at that age. So yes, I agree that it's challenging. If they're little, right, you have the advantage that they tend to sleep more. And also tend to sleep pretty soundly, right? Like literally they will sleep on you while you do things. Hopefully you're not necessarily in a position where you have to do that, but I think taking advantage of nap times or bedtimes is often helpful. Also, if they're little, I know that and you're in the position that you can do this, staggering your leave can be helpful. With my wife and I, we did that to some extent with both kids, so that essentially we had at least a part-time at home parent for the first 8 months for the first one and 10 months for the second. And so that also relieved a little bit of pressure on the one who was working full-time at that point. But that, yeah, it gets harder, right? That kind of 1 to 2 year range where they're very mobile. They are interested and engaged in doing a lot, but aren't necessarily napping so much. It's a challenge to try to kind of keep an eye on them, and also meet your obligations. I would say I think some of these same things still hold. Establishing the ground rules of working time and not working time, even though it's going to take some time for them to pick that up. I think it's still good to start with that. I think it's also important to then underscore the times that you're not at work too, right? To show them that it's not about not being available. It's about just at different times, the family is doing different things. And at one time you're working, and then at another time, you're absolutely available for whatever they're doing.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. And Paul, you have a question, and this will be our last question on this topic before we move on.
I guess it was more of a
Before we
comment,
start
but
getting
yeah, but related to what you guys were talking about. When my kids were like 1 and 2, and this is the point when we were full telework all the time, and this would be like the whole day. So now I kind of have some hybrid where I'm in the office and some of the time I'm teleworking. But at that point, what I did, because they were so young and I didn't really think they could understand me talking about, why I wasn't available. What I did was I would actually say, "Goodbye, kids, I'm leaving," and pretend like I was going out the front door. Right. And I would actually hide, just like drop down low, go down the hallway. My wife would keep them distracted for a minute. Right. And I would hide in there and then close the door. And I did not come out all day. And I just, and they didn't even know I was in there for an entire year, I think, something like that. Now, at some point they figured it out, but he was like 2.5 by then, and he could understand that, that I had to go work, and I was able to explain it better by then. But when it's not explainable, sometimes it's just easiest to hide, or to trick them, I guess, in a loving way.
I think it is. I think that phase especially is one where there are going to be different solutions for each family, right? There's depending on exactly where your kid is and what works for them. It may be something different.
Very creative, Paul. All right, Julia, are you ready for your slides?
I am.
Super.
Hang on a
Thank
minute.
you.
Right,
That was a great
this.
discussion. Thanks. Keep those questions coming. We haven't left the topic. We're just going to move on and then come back to it.
Okay, can you all see the slides or the presenter view? Are you seeing the slide view? Oh, I've lost sound. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
It looks like slide view.
Okay, great. So I'm with Monty's comment in the back of my mind. I had been focusing on communities, remote communities. So I'm going to, and I do speak to teams, but let me start by saying that I work at MIT Lincoln Laboratory. And for those of you who don't know, MIT Lincoln Laboratory is a federally funded research and development center for the Department of Defense. We are primarily supporting the Air Force. So you see the distribution statement, which is probably a little different than yours, but there it is. So that with that in mind, what I wanted to do was to get a sense from people just as we start. So we're going to use something called chatter. I have 3 questions here. And if you would, in the chat, I'll give you I'll give you like 30 seconds. Let me get all the way through the question. If you would tell me, if you are working remotely, and if so, are you working more than 50% of the time? And do you regularly engage with a remote or distributed community of practice? So I'm going to okay, clock is running. So just, pop it in the chat there and we'll get to see what percentage of people. We did this in person. It was easier. Yep, lots of remotes. Yep. And lots of people in remote distributed communities of practice. Excellent, because that means that we will be able to, hopefully I can get some good suggestions from you. I know that Elaine was hoping for lots of good hard questions. I'm hoping that we can have like a good discussion, and I also can learn some new techniques. So, this is great. This is great. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So there's a long history of virtual gatherings, particularly in the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy had a project that was at Argonne, the Futures Lab, that called the Access Grid. And a number of meetings were held over the Access Grid. There were trainings over the Access Grid. And I should say, I come from the high performance computing community. And in that community, there are a lot of things that we simply had to build in order to work together. And one of them was the access grid for communication. And so one of the great things about this is that for people who couldn't attend in person to a meeting or a conference, whether that was because the cost of the conference, the location, or accessibility issues of actually physically flying and going somewhere. The Access Grid gave you the ability to go to a large room with other people. It was designed for a group-to-group discussions. And so you had a social aspect that was designed into the Access Grid. And it was basically to share tools and data and conversation and projects. It was really designed for scientific projects. Now, there are a lot of challenges that were associated with that. Again, it was a research project. So like all things that start as research projects in any of the labs, they then, it takes a while to see it come out into the commercial space. And I would say it was about 10 years. I mean, there were a number of other tools for virtual work, Polycom, but they were kind of crappy. And Zoom was probably the best, and it still took about, we had SC05 we used, we literally had SC to the desktop. So you could attend SC from your desktop using Access Grid technology. And it was a good decade before Zoom was really doing or coming into the fore. So maybe more than that. And I still don't see that we have roving AGs or roving Zooms on the floor of SC, although we do have people had Zoom meetings in their booths. So that a number of challenges come out of this, and anybody in the group who's been working with remote and distributed teams realizes that building the social connection can still be hard. So there's a time zone. We're going to get past that time zone, but building social connection can still be hard. There are people that I met through the Access Grid project and then met them and knew them for quite some time before I met them in person. And but oftentimes it's easier to build from a group of people where you've worked in person, and then you're going to move out. And I should say the Access Grid, the folks at the Access Grid, the community got together once a year for an in-person event in order to keep that community sort of refreshed and get up new ideas and have those moments where you just sort of like things spark out of discussion. So over time, high performance computing it's inherently distributed, but very few people are sitting next to those systems. So it's required new tools as we went through and we built those systems, and then just building research teams for those systems. And so, the World Wide Web came out of this community, the Mosaic browser came out of this community, the Access Grid came out of this community. And over time, industry has started to expand and develop other collaboration tools so you can share documents, code repositories, task tracking, and shared communication networks for teams of for remote project teams. So we know that we have the tools, and so now really the issue is, and we can talk about how we would like to improve the tools. And certainly as a community, I think that we've got a lot of very bright, creative people who can really think about these are the other needs we need. But let's putting the tools aside, let's think about what we're looking at from the human perspective, right? And so I tried to just roughly say here that there are some the ways that we interact, right? So there's a transactional, you go and you see somebody, you see them once, you do something, and then you maybe never see them again. There's some other place where, like, imagine you're a customer and you're a regular customer at a coffee shop, and they recognize you and they're like, oh, we know what you want, and they have it ready, right? You have this relationship that's frequent enough, but it's still more on a one-on-one sort of basis. And then the next one that I'm sort of lumping into the community focus is if you're working as a work team or a community of practice. So I'm going to differentiate these slightly in that a work team, you all have the project. There's maybe a project manager, but there's at least a PI on the project. So there's somebody who's sort of in charge of making sure you all sort of stay together, and that meetings and people attend meetings, and you're held accountable for that, in the sense, for work. There are work requirements that you have. So there's an accountability there that's built into those work teams. A community of practice is more, it's something voluntary, right? You come to it because it's important to you. It's important to share with other people. And building and keeping that going can be hard, but at least you're starting with something that you feel that everyone there feels is important. So next. So I want to give this very surprising example of a virtual community. I mean, this is something you wouldn't expect to have worked, and would never have been tried but for a pandemic. So Irish traditional music is played in person, generally in Ireland. It would be at somebody's local pub, meaning you can easily walk there, or it's a very short drive. And people get together regularly and they play music. And when you think about music, you think about it being in a very specific place, because you want all of these. The beauty of the Irish traditional music is that it has so many different instruments that you have all these voices coming together. So when you have a pandemic and you have a lot of people playing flutes or whistles where they cannot wear masks, how do you maintain this community of music? And it's important to maintain it, because I should also say this is not something that's huge, and it's not mainstream, right? So there's no, there's some funding by in Ireland for it, but it's not something that's going to, that the commercial world is going to keep going, right? So you have to maintain it. So the thing to keep in, whoops, I think I messed up didn't move my slides the right way. Okay, I'm going to go to the next one and then we'll go back. So Irish traditional music, you have the multiple instruments that they're merging. It's live, it's in the community. You do it in community in your local pub. You're sharing the space for music, you're sharing conversation, you're staying in touch with everybody, and people are coming every week. So the virtual guided session that I attended, that's still going actually. It was started in March of 2020, and there was a session last Saturday. There'll be one in another 2 weeks. People are coming. It's done. You cannot hear other people unless you actually gather a group at your house, but you're playing along with the leaders. They're keeping the conversation going. Everybody is keeping things in the YouTube chat channel, and within that chat channel, even though people are by themselves in their house playing solo across the world and across time zones, they are sharing. When very unexpectedly a hurricane hit Nova Scotia, people in the chat were reaching out. How are you doing? How's this going? And people, and the same is true there. People from across, people in Italy have met people that are now in Ireland, and they're meeting outside of the session in real life now that it's safe. And people return, it's every other week now, but people return every other week to come to this community because the community has been built and the community has been welcoming. And so that's really, we're going to have two weird slides again. There we go. So I wanted to talk about some of the key elements. I usually try to lead with some ideas, and hopefully this will spark some discussion, and hopefully other people will have some other ideas that will help us keep building these virtual communities. So the key piece is that has to be around a shared mission, right? So if it's work, it's a work product, it's a team effort. If it's a volunteer effort, then everybody sort of somehow you have to find a way. Everybody's interested in connecting, and you need to find a way of holding on to them and keeping them in there, right? And if it's music or dance, so there's some common goal among the group of people. Now, for the technology, we've talked about audio, visual. We've got Zoom, Teams, YouTube live sessions. People did Facebook sessions, Instagram, and people are staying, in the chat. if you build that up. There are also, the other tools for communication. I wish there were better tools for communication. It would be kind of nice. The access grid was full duplex. So it was much more like old-fashioned phones, and you could go back and forth when you were talking. Now the Zoom is like others. The person who's loudest gets cut off. So we could still use better technology. So having the technology set that everybody knows to use and can use is key, and having the shared mission. But there are a lot of logistics. Somewhere along the way, you have to have a couple people who are willing to take care of some of those logistics. And that is understanding the value of the team. And sometimes this comes out of the whole people in communication amongst themselves and in community, that it will come out. But one of the key pieces is that when new people come, you need to create a space that's welcoming and inclusive of everybody. You need to really welcome them. Come, join us. Here's a way, if you'd like to help, here's a way to help. Here's a way to engage. It has to be clear to them how they can go about engaging. And in the case of the session, people are chatting in the YouTube, and you're welcome to join. Just say something about whatever the tune or the conversation that's going on. You have to set the expectations of what the community is going to do. Sometimes I haven't really been in one for a while, but you get communities where you set the expectations of behavior, like what's acceptable. But another piece with creating the space that's welcoming and inclusive is also having a space outside of the meeting that you can share. So for instance, in the virtual guided session, they've created a Facebook page. We have all kinds of things, people popping all kinds of things. Someone's been making instruments, and we've been able to see the pictures of them making instruments. So people feel comfortable sharing, and they feel safe sharing, because that Facebook group has been constrained to just the folks who are engaged. Accommodate time zones. And another piece is, when the technology fails, it's really great if you can tell people, go here, and so that you can reconnect. And some of the tips that I had, so that was building the community. I'm still learning. I'm open to as many suggestions about building community as possible. But tips for remote teamwork, which is the other side, which is the smaller version of building a community, is to, and some of these are like, as at the very bottom, the very last bullet is follow the best practices for meetings, right? Something that can be done by email. There's a right tool for different things. If it can be done by email, maybe you don't need a meeting. If it can be done by phone, remember, once upon a time, people used phones. Phones are still very valuable for synchronous conversation if you need to do something quickly. But one of the best practices for meetings is like schedule breaks into those. If there's going to be a long, if you've got a long 2-hour, 3-hour meeting, even if you're in person, you should have a break. And think about what works in the in-person working environment for small groups or even large groups. Think about what you have there and what then translates well to the Zoom one, which is like, if you're working side by side, maybe you don't need the video on. Maybe you don't need the video on, and I could just be here working, deriving, making plots or whatever, and then somebody else is doing another part of the project, but they have a question. They can just chime in and say, hey, I've got this question. I need a sanity check. What do you think of this? Or can you look at this, giving you that indication that it's time to go back and reconnect to look at something. If you were both working in the same office space, it's exactly the same thing. You'd both be doing your piece, and you'd be like, oh, do you have a minute? Can you look at this? You can still do that with Zoom, and it's a matter of replicating that in some way. And use tools that are easy for everybody in the team to access and use. For instance, Microsoft Teams doesn't always work on my Mac. So certain parts of it do, certain parts of it don't. Try to find tools that work well across the team. And understand the positives and negatives, like for what you're doing. What could go wrong when you try to do things online? We had a very, almost like sort of a reality check / embarrassing moment when we were doing a game where we had a game that we were doing with students to give them a sense of how parallel computing works. everybody had to do, at some point, we were all playing, and in real life, we would be using a set of die, but instead they were using a random number generator that generated the die roll, except that everybody was starting from the same seed, so we kept getting the same numbers. And it wasn't until later we're like, here's a teachable moment about high performance computing. And that remember that some tools allow for concurrent access, but not concurrent editing. So think about what the tools are, what tools you need and what works. And I probably should have put this at the very beginning, and maybe I put it at the end. I think I probably put it at the end because I really wanted to emphasize this. Create space for casual conversations. Because in the end, the casual conversation is what builds the social cohesion so that you have that comfort level to ask somebody questions and to have a discussion with them and really build out a project, really build teamwork. So, and with that, I think that's.
Great, Julia, thank you. So Monty, come back on and please ask your question again, given what Julia has said. Has she answered your question, or do you still have your question about that?
Yeah, I think she's really hit on a lot of the key points there. One of the things is just an observation that we've spent a lot of time getting to where we are now, working in the office, so to speak. But I'm not always seeing the same commitment from companies or corporations or whoever to work through the issues to make remote work, hybrid work, whichever way, a blend of the different parts to make that workable. It's going to take some time to continue to learn and work through this. I had a class in the spring on global project management, and that's just kind of where I focused my study in the academic journals. And so it's just interesting to think through those things. And the social aspect, I think there's value in working remotely, but there's also, I think if we prefer the remote, we also got to see the value of face-to-face interaction and not be so rigid on, I want to do everything remote. There are conversations that happen, just like the last little bit that Julia mentioned there are conversations, that social interaction that's not specifically work, but helps you in your work, that happens, that wouldn't happen unless you were face-to-face.
Right.
So I think she hit on a lot of the issues, and it's a good part of the discussion to continue to spend specific effort like this thing we're doing here, to talk through and work through those issues. So it really is valuable to the folks we work for and to our teams.
Yeah,
there are some companies that are started and that they are completely remote. One of them is one that works with neurodiverse people in computing, and they've been highly successful by being remote. They've also worked very hard to make sure and to build in some of that social interaction and make sure that people, they had a system that you would sign up for. It was not mandatory, and they would sort of randomly choose other people for you to talk to and have a Zoom meeting with, so that you would just know other people in the community and have other people to talk to in the company. They had some good ideas of things that I agree with you. I should say right off, similar to what Scott's disclosure. I do a lot with computing, so I am very fortunate I can work from home. So I should say I do a lot with computing, and I work in the unclassified space. Mm-hmm. So I can work from home. That is not true of everybody.
Yes. I'm really happy that you pointed that out, because there are a lot of workers, a lot of members of the workforce that are either essential or they're bench scientists, or they're working in spaces where they can't work as easily remotely. And so this is where this the question of a hybrid work environment really becomes one where we've got to really all work toward that successful goal. It's not co-located people only or remote people only that have to put the effort in. It's all of us. And to your point, Julie, about the successful companies that are distributed. If we look at GitLab, I like to follow their head of remote work, Darren Murph. Because GitLab is a remote first organization. And I love the way that they have really set themselves up that way. And when you think about successful meetings, if you use remote as your criteria for making a meeting successful, then your in-person meeting will be as successful too. I mean, it's just good work practices, as Scott was saying. Some of these best lessons learned really boil down to, just being the best that we can possibly be, whether it's at home or in the workplace.
So one last comment, and then is that we have people at remote sites. We don't have the lab doesn't have very many remote sites, but once we went to the pandemic and we started having these Zoom meetings, like, oh, finally, like you're seeing me. You're seeing me. I get to chime in, because before that they were just, so some like on the other end of a Polycom or whatever. The laboratory's done a lot more effort, and they've gone through and they've updated, modified every single office space in the laboratory so that hybrid meetings can always be held. There's no requirement that it's in person.
Yeah. And do we think that companies are going to be as enthusiastic as, work in the office? I believe that we will see that there are some companies that will be as enthusiastic as we have just said.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you,
Yeah,
Mike.
I was going to say, I think that just building on that, Elaine,
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
companies have had to keep postponing their back to the office, right? And that was, sometimes that was about, at first it was about COVID levels still being too high, but then it transitions to large proportions of the workforce didn't really want to go back, right? And I mean, I think different situations work for different people. I think there are people that do better in a physical office location for a variety of reasons and people who don't. But I think we're discovering that there is maybe a larger proportion of people than we first thought who really enjoy working either full remote or in a hybrid work situation. And so I think
Right.
to the extent that companies are interested in attracting and retaining those people, they'll need to find ways to continue to support them and integrate them into the larger company culture.
That's a great point. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly go through the last section. And really, I challenge you, come on, let's see some of your like hard questions, your early career. You must have a lot of questions, so please put them in the chat. So what I wanted to just close with was just five lessons learned for me during the pandemic, and how I think you might be able to apply this to your career. So like Julie, I've been working at Sandia for a number of years. Most of that time actually has been remote. And so one of the things that I've learned from this experience is that we really need to become comfortable with change. I mean, it's just, this would be something that would benefit everyone. Just learn to be comfortable, to embrace it even. Your early career, you're just starting out, there's going to be a lot of change that you're going to go through. And so being just aware of yourself and how you respond to change is a really good idea. And so by this, what I really am talking about is this notion of perspective taking, where maybe you put yourself into someone else's shoes to understand, what they're going through. This will help you build your emotional resiliency. And also change in your career is a journey. So be ready for that journey. And one of the most exciting things about a journey is that with change, you can grow. And sometimes you may even grow out of something that you think you should be. And so I would just challenge you all as early career to be open to that, be open to the fact that you might evolve in different ways and take on new tasks or take on new expertise areas. And so if you've never seen this, this TED Talk, What Makes a Hero, this is a really great talk about the hero's journey. And so I've included the link here. You can also just look it up, What Makes a Hero, Matthew Winkler. It's a really nice little short talk about the hero's journey, which is basically, you start off, you encounter some sort of conflict, you address it, there's a story arc, there's a climax, and then there's a resolution to whatever that conflict is. And so it'd be nice just to kind of think about that. It's a fun way to think about your life and your career. The second lesson learned I have is that when you can, as early career, just go ahead and contribute. There may be some times when you have a hidden talent. Maybe it's hidden because nobody knows something about you that is really a talent that you can apply in a particular moment. Go for it, apply your talent. And so I did this early in the pandemic with my institution. We were having a hard time actually just with all of the numbers of people that were online and new technologies. And since I was a longtime remote worker and had a lot of experience, I just leaned in and I started helping people. And so it turned out to be actually a really good experience for me. And I learned a lot from a lot of other people who were going through it for the first time. The other thing is that you want to make sure that you develop your single most important superpower, and that is going to be communication. So if you are a remote worker in particular, the way you communicate, I should say the ways you communicate are going to be really, really important. And what I mean by this is that, synchronous communication is going to require different things than asynchronous communication. So when you're in a face-to-face environment, you want to be, hey, if you're happy, smile, don't worry about that. Even if you're online, if you're on a phone call, smile. The smile comes through in your voice. And so these are ways that you can communicate, play with that particular modality, understand where you're strong, where you're weak, and have fun with it. Because learning to communicate well in all environments is really going to be something that will catapult your career. So the fourth lesson learned I have for you is to have a growth mindset. And that is, you want to think beyond some of the boundaries that maybe you have for yourself or that others have for you. Reimagine things. And so this is one thing that I think was really, that really came out to me during the pandemic was it was an opportunity for all of us to reimagine ourselves. I mean, you can see how the workforce just changed and how that was reimagined. So work was reimagined. The importance of location was reimagined. Relationships were in fact, reimagined. And so there will be other opportunities in the future. And one point that I've made from the very beginning of the pandemic that's been a really a lesson that I've learned is that change, and when we are in moments of crisis, that really are opportunities for us to unlearn old habits. We all have habits that may not apply in different settings. Determine which ones those are, and you may have to unlearn things, and that's really okay. Because that will just create a space and an opening for all of us to be more empathetic, to be more resilient and responsive to others. And so I think having a growth mindset is really a good idea. And I actually love this quote by Martin Fowler. And really what he's saying here is that we can't necessarily think of it as co-located work and remote work. It's not that. It's not either or. There are so many different points along the spectrum from remote and co-located. And chances are, as Julie mentioned in her presentation, we've been doing this for a while. You've been doing it in different settings. If you've been working from a coffee house or a cafe, if you've been working on travel, if you have been working in a different building in the same campus, those are distributed environments. And so we're used to this, but things are a little bit different now. We're going through this together in a way we never have before. And so we're learning a lot of new things. So I really would say that having a growth mindset is something that's going to be very helpful. And then my last lesson learned that I had for early career was really to consider that innovation and creativity and productivity happen in all environments. They have to, right? So it can happen in a hybrid setting. Do not allow yourself to get into the trap where you're told that creativity and innovation only happen in face-to-face environments. Yes, it's facilitated in that environment. It's a lot easier in that environment, but we can't always rely on that as being the only way it's going to happen. It's, the onus is on all of us to be creative and innovative and productive, and no matter what environment that we're in. And so as early career, you're going to be asked to be in these different environments. And so I really think that the best thing that we can do is to just have this winning attitude. Whatever happens, just take the attitude that you're going to do your best at it. And I'm pretty sure you will. And so again, you know, my top 5 lessons that I've learned from the pandemic that I believe are just good lessons learned for any career advancement. First of all, get comfortable with change. Be ready to even outgrow your own old life. Contribute even in times of crisis, and especially in times of crisis. If you have a hidden talent, please apply it. Make sure that you develop communication skills. Communication will take you very far. Have a growth mindset, one that will allow you to reimagine the way that you think of your career and the way others think about what you're capable of doing. And then finally, remember that productivity, creativity, and innovation are always going to happen. Find the way to make it happen for you in your environment. Just as an aside, a story. So I have an art background, and what artists do is that artists will work on several things at the same time. And so what's one of the things that I've applied to science? I know when I'm hitting a wave and it's like surfing and I'm able to ride that wave. And I know when I'm hitting a wall. And so when I hit the wall, I work on something else. And so it just helps me be creative as I'm working remotely. That's just, you know, that's my personal strategy that I thought I would share with you. So with that, let's see, let's keep talking. Are there any questions in the chat? Or does anyone have any questions that they would like to say? Alfred, I see a long post from you. Would you like to come off and get involved in the discussion?
Yeah, I hope that I'm not talking all the time.
No.
Okay, so from what I heard is that there are more mental illness issues during COVID because people feel cooped up at home. So I'm just wondering if this is more of a problem of unprofessional people, people I don't know who work in Burger King or McDonald's or something like that. Versus people like most of us who actually can talk to people around the world through emails and Zoom or whatever, and so we don't feel as cooped up than maybe somebody else. So I'm just wondering, actually, if those study actually implies us as well, that we're somehow immune from that, or actually our professional people are just as vulnerable to mental illness as well when we have to spend most of the time in a small place.
All right, so we can all answer. I'm not familiar with that study, and I think that all humans crave human interaction. And so mental illness is something that we are all susceptible to. So, but I don't know if certain groups or certain like work situations are more susceptible than others. I can't say anything about that. But what I can say is that having been a remote worker for much of my career, I find that what's really important is to develop very strong ties in my local environment. So if you're working remotely, for example, and you're communicating with the rest of your organization, mostly through, these remote technologies and, in this remote setting, what I would do is find a way to build a community locally for yourself so that you are getting that social interaction that you and all humans need. That would be one thing that I would do. And if you do feel that you're having difficulty, please reach out to others for help on that. There is no reason to go at it alone.
I would say
Go
that I
ahead.
found the COVID situation a lot more challenging than my previous kind of 12 years of remote work because of things that Elaine was saying, right? I was working remotely, but I would, I had a routine which involved, going to cafes, or sometimes I would go to, the university at which my wife taught, just for, I would call it a change of scenery. But, I had those connections, and shortly after COVID started, and, I wasn't going anywhere, but also we moved. I used to live in St. Louis, and I moved in summer 2020 here to Reno. And so for at least a year, I pretty much literally didn't know anyone who lived in the city because we weren't doing things right. And I just, for myself, that was very challenging. It was definitely a different situation than kind of the original remote work. And now those two are somewhat interconnected, right? Because different people have different levels of comfort now with going out and being in different situations. And but I agree with what Elaine said, that fundamentally I think it's we're all people that crave human interaction. I read that there was a study about this, kind of what the aspect being what helps people to feel grounded and connected. And it turns out that it wasn't related to the number of good friends you had, but it was related to, and I can't remember the term, but essentially your kind of informal community of people that you see on a regular basis. So like you go to the cafe and you see the same people who, you say, hi, how are you, right? You have that kind of brief exchange, but that person, they're always there. And it's those people, whether you have those people in your life or not, that is the largest contributor to whether or not you feel grounded and you feel like part of the place where you live. And I think that's what a lot of people struggle to find during lockdown.
Was it weak ties and strong ties?
Weak ties, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, right.
So at the laboratory, I think most of the people that are on here are DOE people. Am I right? So you may have the same issue that we had. They put a lot of effort and emphasis on providing links and information about mental health resources, recognizing this, and really making that effort to make people understand that it wasn't going to affect their clearance. Because this always came up as an issue. It's like, well, if I go for help, is that going to affect the clearance that I have to have? And so they actually did a lot of, I thought they really handled it well in terms of, gently offering people, explaining, that it wasn't going to hurt that if you really need these, go ahead and take advantage of these resources. MIT was very, very generous with having a lot of resources. But I think that, and I don't know about the difference between professionals and people who are not working in professional capacity. I would break it out differently. I would have said people who can easily work from home and people who can't. There was a different stress level for those, and I have nursing friends, enormous stress level. But I think that so people who were just starting their careers at the laboratory compared to people who were established, knew people at the laboratory, knew the laboratory culture, and then went off and started doing things remotely because, as Elaine said, they had traveled. So they'd done things from travel, and they'd done things, when they were somewhere else. But people who are just starting out had that, I'm not quite sure how this place works, because you're never going to have that kind of, we're a secure facility. So you're never going to be in that kind of environment in college. So you come in here and you're like, you almost don't, the onboarding, we realized we need better onboarding. I mean, that would help generally, aside from the remote. But I wonder, so that was the only thing. I think it was harder on people who were just starting their careers because they didn't have that community of people to talk to about other work type things, aside from like not being able to be out talking to people in the neighborhood or feeling that neighborhood feeling after having moved, or they were in small apartments and they were all trying to find room. They're like sitting in the corner of a bed trying to work. So I think that particular group had a more difficult time.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. And, during the pandemic, when I was trying to make connections around the laboratory with folks that I didn't have, what I did a lot of, and maybe this is what a lot of you early career folks are doing, is you rely a lot on documentation. So, look at the documentation to try to understand your laboratory's culture, or it doesn't even have to be a lab, but your organization's culture, And of course, keeping in mind that it's really only going to be what is formalized, right? So there's a lot of that tacit knowledge that you get from conversation, you get from smelling a place, basically, that is really hard to get when you're early career and you're starting out remotely. So the best thing to do is, make yourself, open up yourself to join other presentations on Zoom that are maybe outside of your domain a little bit. Just start to just attend different things in your organization so that you learn a little bit more about what that organization is all about. It's not easy. It's very, very difficult. And we have to really rely on the what's documented and what's codified, unfortunately. There's one more question that I really would like for us to take. We are at time. So Scott and Julie, are you able to stay on a little bit longer?
I am, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, good. I was actually
So-
going to ask because I think Jessica's question here is really important.
It is important. And so for those of you who are in the audience, we're going to stay on a little bit longer. I'm going to try to give us, I'd like to give us till 4:30, if that's okay with you. That's another like 15 or so minutes or 13 minutes. And let's try to get to these questions. And, for those of you who want to stay on, you are completely welcome to interact with us. So Jessica, would you like to unmute and ask your question? This is a really great question.
Sure, thank you. So the question there is, pretty plain. What recommendations can we put into action as early career folks who need to perhaps raise issues to an organizational leadership level, that there are culture changes that need to be put in place for these hybrid teams to really thrive? And, I noted there that there is a risk factor here for early career folks to be seen as asking for too much. You want it too much your way, follow the organization's way. And oh, by the way, you all are part of that snowflake generation where it has to be just the way you need it.
All right, well, thank you for that. That's I appreciate your candor. I'm going to answer it two ways, if you don't mind, and then I'd like for Scott and Julie to answer as well. So I'll answer it. The first way I'll answer this is that whenever you have a recommendation or a suggestion, or whenever you have something that you'd like to change, I would frame it as a recommendation. So I wouldn't just complain about it. I would say, this is the challenge. This is the issue. Here's a potential solution, or here's what we could do next to try to solve it together. So that's one strategy. This is just in general, anytime you want to try to affect change. But specifically to the point of being perceived negatively, since your early career, what I would do is try to find allies who can help you. And so maybe it's not just you taking the change that you want to take to your organization's leadership. Maybe it's you plus your allies, affecting change. That actually happened to me. I was giving these presentations, doing these panels. People reached out to me and told me what they were experiencing and said, would you, can you help us elevate, these issues? And so I would look for allies in your organization to help you elevate something that might be happening that your leadership may not be aware
of. Yeah, I'll stick with my thoughts here. I would, second the first part that Elaine was saying there, that when it comes to making suggestions for change, that it can be helpful to frame it in terms of how this change will help the organization accomplish its goals or its mission, right? That this change, it improves, your productivity in some way, or, whatever it is, but essentially you're removing barriers to success, right? You're enabling the organization to be more productive and more successful. I also think coming up with changes that are as specific as possible is helpful, right? Like sometimes, and they should not, but sometimes this happens, right? That if you come to leadership and say, I am concerned about the culture surrounding hybrid work, the response is to be defensive and reactionary, right? Because you've brought a concern and they stop listening. And ideally, this is not the case, right? Ideally, leaders of organizations are people who are able to hear and listen, but sometimes that doesn't happen. But that's where I think sometimes a specific suggestion can be helpful, right? Because then if you go to leadership and say, I was wondering if we could change our policy so that by default, every meeting has an online presence. Like, this is a very specific request that's much easier to make a yes, no decision on, and that doesn't necessarily have any kind of loaded like judgment of the organization embedded in it. And so that's another suggestion I would make, is to come up with, you know, make a priority list of what specific changes would most help you, and then pick the top change or two and start with those. I also like Elaine's idea of finding out who else in your organization also would support those changes, and then going as a group to show that it's something that many members of the organization agree would increase their productivity and make them better contributors.
I'm going to say much the same thing. I generally phrase things as challenges and strategies, right? These are the challenges, here are some strategies. David mentioned employee research groups, resource groups. So we have a number of ERGs, employee resource groups. And if I had some challenge or something that I wanted to bring up, and it wasn't being discussed by, we have a very flat organization. We have technical staff, and then we have group leaders, and then we have the director's office, where we're not nearly as big as any of the DOE labs. So I would reach out to some of those employee resource groups and see, are any of your members talking about these things? Do they find these challenges? And also highlight what you found was the value of working in a hybrid space. I don't know if your laboratories or your organizations have been doing this, but man, Lincoln Laboratory sent us almost quarterly surveys. We're very data driven, almost quarterly surveys about what we were thinking about hybrid work. What did we like it? Did we, and a range of things. And they got back a large number of people who really liked hybrid work. So when they did this, it all fed into, they had a whole committee with the COVID-19 type work from the director's office, and then the future of work and what that was going to look like, and what the options are. And the options range from, I want to be in there 5 days a week, to I don't want to ever have to go in. And they're going about the way to make sure that can work for people. But I think the employee and employee resource groups were part of that conversation. I think that may be a good place to start, because then it's already a group and they know what their members are thinking. So if they're thinking along the same lines, they already probably have a direct link to your management, and you can start pulling them together. We've had a couple of things happen at the laboratory where 2 or 3, or even just two employee resource groups have gotten together and really gone forward and said, this is something that would be important. It's something people need, and management has started to pay attention.
That's great. Jessica, did we answer your question? Do you want to follow up with maybe some comments?
I think those are all great suggestions. I think I'm just always looking for tactics and recommendations, so those are helpful. I think too, thinking about how the more global, so to speak, presence of an ERG can influence at perhaps a more middling level. Those organizations that are maybe not as flat as what you described, Julia, that there's a lot more hierarchy going on, and so there can be a lot of local culture to influence there. So thank you.
But the local culture then can spread through the laboratory. When people see that it's working, it will spread through the laboratory, through the organization, I should say.
Yeah. Thank you. So let's see, we're at 4:25. Julia, Scott, do you have any final comments you want to make? Is there something that we forgot to mention that maybe came out in our discussion at SC?
Sure, there's something we forgot.
Yeah, I'm sure there's something, because it's such a broad topic. I agree. Yeah.
No, I was just going to conclude with, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this and kind of the related, general work-life topics today. I honestly think that both of these ideas, finding good balance and also feeling like part of a community, are honestly some of the most important factors that contribute to someone's success at work, right? Are you able to kind of meet all the responsibilities you have on your shoulders, and are you able to feel like you're part of an organization and you're a contributing person, and people notice you and respect you and feel like you belong. And so I think having conversations like this around that is important. I think it's also important to see how many people are interested in these topics, right? That these are topics that are good to talk about, good to exchange ideas and thoughts about, and stories on, so that we know that we're all kind of finding our ways through this on our own, but we have shared challenges and shared solutions.
That's awesome, Scott. Thank you. Yeah, nicely put.
So I would say the same, and I would also say, because I'm probably the oldest person on the panel, that it's nice seeing. I mean, I can look back over a longer span and I can see the changes, and it's nice to see. It feels like it's moving to more acceptance of the hybrid learning. I agree that communities. I focused on communities because I think that does help people stay connected to other people. And the parenting, these are the things that, when you think about work, make it a more not, I don't want to say more palatable, because that makes it sound like it's terrible, but they are the things that help enhance your work environment and your work life, and it is important because it is a big piece of your life. It
really is. And I want to thank both of you for really keying on this fact that things are getting better. I mean, they're not as bad as they seem. I remember being that sole voice on the spider, phone. I mean, really, literally, it's gotten so much better. Even the ways that our employee resource groups are really reaching out to remote workers and including us in activities. And I've just seen tremendous change and growth. And so I personally am very optimistic about the future, and I really want to thank you both. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Julie, for joining me today. This has been really great. Thank you, Suzanne, for moderating and helping with this session. Really, this is the best way for me to end this calendar year. I want to wish you all, a happy holiday, a happy new year, and we'll see each other in the next calendar year. Thank you very much to everyone. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you
for
having us.
Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.